You're saying what a lockdown does is to delay the outbreak of a large number of infections, but the virus doesn't disappear. So when the
Abs-
lockdown is lifted, the virus is present, and that same large number of infections can occur after the lockdown has been lifted. Have I understood
ab-
correctly?
Absolutely. So lockdown buys us time, not a solution, but buys us time to get ready. The question we have to ask is, were you prepared at all for this particular kind of an epidemic where the mortality could be very high? And answer is no. This is a characteristic of viral epidemic. They spread from person to person, accelerate themselves, and suddenly they reach a point in time they can't spread again. And this is because of the immunity that the community developed. We call it the herd immunity. And that particular wall prevents the transmission of disease anymore. Finally, developing herd immunity is the only lasting solution. No other solution, because we don't have any drugs for this, we don't have any vaccine for it. So the only way we can do is our immunity protect ourselves. So you need to somehow move towards a herd immunity in a sensible fashion. But the problem is that kind of herd immunity, if you develop, you will have lots of deaths, unacceptable number of deaths. And that is the anxiety. How do you get herd immunity without having high mortality? So that solution emerges from the performance of coronavirus so far. It appears to be an extremely mild disease in the younger population. It's a killer when you grow older. So in our population, there are younger population who can face it and be very little harmed. But the problem with the whole issue is that elderly are highly susceptible for serious outcome.
And in India's case, 90% of the Indian population is under 60. It's only 10% that are over 60. If I understand you correctly, you're saying we can afford to try and build herd immunity using the 90% under 60 because their susceptibility to the virus is very different. Only a small number will fall ill, a very small number will sadly die, but they will be able to protect everyone because they will acquire herd immunity. Is that a correct understanding of your
It
position?
is a very correct understanding, except that there will be a few losses in the young too. And losses, that losses can be reduced if they get access to treatment. The problem, remember, in a limited resource area like India, if a whole lot of people suddenly land up for healthcare, for acute illness, then nobody will get healthcare. If the young has to be protected, there should be adequate healthcare when in case they fall ill. We need to keep the elderly, the high-risk group, somehow out of the picture. Somehow you make sure, and we'll come to that later, but how do we do it is a different question. Imagine everybody over the 60 is somehow guarded against infection. The remaining 90% get the infection. Most of them will get subclinical infection. Some will get mild infection, a very, very small proportion serious illnesses. In the absence of elderly falling ill, even a scarce resources may be sufficient with some amount of beefing up to support the needs of the people falling ill in the younger population. But if the elderly also are falling ill simultaneously, there would be impossible to look after.
Now, let me ask you this. At what level of infection does herd immunity become effective? Are we talking about 40%, 45%, 50, 60? What percent of the population needs to have been exposed and infected for herd immunity to become effective?
Well, I got to make an educated guess from what people have been talking about. It does depend a lot on a lot of parameters, but I would put my money on 60%. That is provided you not only allow young people to get immunity, but you allow this to happen in a phased manner. In other words, you need to continue to prevent large gatherings, where the transmission can crowding. So, people will live without high exposure. If you combine these two, expose the young, but protect them from extreme exposures, so that it is actually a kind of a very tight rope walking.
Okay. So you're saying at the same time as exposing the young, you must ensure that large gatherings are banned, which means movie halls remain shut, theaters remain shut, restaurants, I presume, remain shut, big malls remain shut. Any large gathering remains banned, but you allow the young to get back to work in the hope that they will quickly build up herd immunity. You think the ballpark figure, it's guesswork on your part, is 60%. At that point, our society as a whole should have built up safety and protection against coronavirus.
Absolutely. And at that point, we go back to our old ways.
And in a very real sense, we are saying to our young, your country needs you, your resilience, but also your willingness to put yourself in some form of danger, hopefully not very big, is the only thing that can save India.
Good. And it should be voluntary. If somebody wants to hide, perfectly all right. But
Yes.
Most Indians will move in. Point is that how do you control a whole population, and their behavior? And the anxiety is that, will they fall in line? There's a convenience in lockdown because you can control people. The ideal way should be where people on their own take care of them. Every extra day on lockdown is going to be increase the hardship of a section of the community.
Approach. Dr. Muliyil, the first problem is that we in India live in joint families. The young live with their elderly. When the young go out to work and they come back in the evening, they could end up infecting their parents and grandparents. So, how do you protect the elderly when we all live together in joint families?
Two ways to look at it. Number one, this cannot be legislated. It should come from within the family and by the individual. Elderly should know how to protect them, and that information should be clearly transmitted. There is no way you can police this. It has to be done by them. Now, number two, I know, for example, this particular move may not be perfect. Everybody cannot follow this. But even if there is a 50% compliance to this in the country, there will be a 50% reduction, not 50, but at least 40% reduction in the mortality. So the difference is how compliant the population will be.
How on earth do the elderly isolate from the young in one room?
Now let us look at this way. The well-to-do will have no problem for self-isolating. The middle class also will have the facilities to do it. But when it comes to the lower groups, we have problem. You don't have to be a slumdog, the poor in the city, wherever. And there is a difficulty. Now, a question we have to ask is what percentage of the elderly live in the slum? That age-specific mortality has always been favoring the well-to-do. They tend to live longer. But my point is that just because you can't get everybody to follow this is not the best solution. We have to try our best to have maximum compliance. I think recently somebody else mentioned, I in an interview suggested that in a rural area, the elderly person can also sleep under a mango tree. All I am saying is we have to be resourceful enough to think of out of the box.
That age group over 60 living in slums will be highly endangered, won't they?
Yes, the slum is a mystery to all public health people. It's so difficult to control everything. The sheer density of population is overwhelming. And these are the realities we have to accept.
India's young, compared to the young in the West, are malnourished, and as a result of their physical weakness, they are more prone to infection and disease. Doesn't that mean that in the process of building up herd immunity, many more Indian young will be vulnerable compared to European and American young? It's not the same. Our young may not be, and probably will not be, as resilient as the young in the West.
But the reality is not that. The immunity against this infection is one of the fundamental part of our body chemistry. And you have to be extremely malnourished for that to be effective. I have no doubt about it.
Let me put this to you. In the early days, long before he fell ill himself, Boris Johnson had attempted for some 24, 36 hours to follow the path of herd immunity. One of his famous statements was to tell the country, we have to take it on the chin. Very quickly, Britain changed course. You're still recommending herd immunity despite the British experience. People will wonder why.
Well, Boris Johnson underestimates the size of the chin you need to take the blow. The point is that they did not probably anticipate the number of people who suddenly land up seeking acute care. And it is not socially acceptable. The calculated number of deaths expected was known to the experts. But then they realized it is not socially acceptable to present it all in a short period of time. I would like you to know they have not moved away from the concept of herd immunity. But what they realized is, if you try to get there too fast, that will be very, very socially upsetting. The society can't take it. So you have to spread it out. The point is they didn't separate the elderly from the rest. What I am suggesting is that our country is so large and the expected deaths are so large, we need to try and reduce this mortality by making sure a large proportion elderly never comes into contact with coronavirus through the herd immunity of the young. If that is the case, we actually, completely avoid this high mortality issue. The issue you should remember is we don't have alternative. We have to ask the question, given these restrictions, given that we can't have a lockdown for a long time, given that there are some of the places where you cannot just separate young and the old, what is the extent of reduction in mortality you can still achieve? And that is where we have to aim at.
The herd immunity, as you said in part one, is the only lasting solution. Now, as you said in part two, we don't have an alternative. We cannot remain in lockdown for a year or two till a vaccine is developed. That would cripple our economy, and hunger and destitution would kill our people. We don't have an alternative. Will herd immunity protect us from a second wave, or is that unlikely?
The very fact that a second wave means the herd immunity, which is supposed to be 60%, has reduced, say, to 50%. There's no way a virus can come back when the herd immunity. Now, the 60% I'm talking about is a number for our conversation. I don't know, it could be 70, 75, I don't know. But 60 is the working one. So the moment it comes down, that virus will return. And if that happens, the good proportion of the population will still be protected from the earlier infection. They don't have to worry. We just have to hope that this gap will be at least 2 years for it to return, in which case we'll have a vaccine by then.